Today we're gonna react to this video that this guy called the Orthodox Universalist put out probably 4 months ago. It's called "Would Have Been Better for Judas If He Had Never Been Born." Now, as you probably realize, he's a universalist, so he holds to the belief that eventually everybody will be saved. So Judas and every single human being, possibly even Satan, I don't know about that. But in this particular case, he's tackling one of what I would consider to be the most bulletproof argument against universalism, which is this episode where Jesus, talking about Judas, says it would have been better for him if he had never been born. Now, we're going to see why this statement of Jesus puts such a big threat to the claim of universalism. But I'm going to let this person speak. I don't know his name, unfortunately. But this guy sounds very honest intellectually. He's still manning the argument against universalism. And he's doing actually a great job delineating the argument itself and explaining how strong it is against universalism. And then he's gonna come up with his solution of the problem. So let's see what he has to say.
The logic goes something like this. If all men will eventually be saved, then everyone will ultimately attain the bliss of eternal unity with God. The attainment of the bliss of eternal unity with God will surpass any suffering associated with the existence that necessarily precedes it. If this suffering of Judas is so great that it would have been better for him to have never existed, then we must conclude that the surpassing bliss of eternal unity with God will not be attained by him. For then it would be untrue for Jesus to state that it would have been better for Judas to have never been born.
All right, so this is perfect. This is the argument. Now, let me summarize it for whoever wants to maybe understand it a little bit easier than this. There are basically two options here: Judas never been born, or Judas born, betraying Jesus, going to hell according to the universalist claim for a limited amount of time, and then eventually reconciled with God forever and ever in heaven, right? First option, what is the value of the first option, of the first experience? Well, never being born, there's no experience, right? There's no experience of pain, there's no experience of eternal life, there's no experience of heaven, of happiness, suffering, nothing. So the value of that experience is obviously zero, right? Now, what is the experience of Judah being born, betraying Jesus, going to hell, and then to heaven? Well, first of all, if Jesus' words are correct, if Judas would have been better off by not being born, well, it means that this second experience would need to have a negative value, right? To be less than that zero, right? The default, never been born zero. So it would mean that the experience of hell temporarily and of eternal life together would give you a negative number. But of course, this is impossible, right? Because eternal life gives you an infinite positive value. And hell, temporary hell, only gives you a finite negative number. And when you sum up an infinite positive number with a finite negative number, well, you don't need a PhD in math to know that the answer is still a net positive infinite number. So it's impossible for Jesus to say, oh, it would have been better for Judas to never, if he had never been born, because in that case, his value would be zero. In the second case, the value would be infinitely positive. So there's not even comparison, right? So hopefully the argument is clear. Now, he's going to give you two counter arguments here. The first one, I'm not going to tackle it that much. I'm going to just spend a couple of minutes probably, because that's not what this video is about. I'm more interested in the second argument he's coming up with. But the first point is, I'm gonna skip through it very quickly because it's not the point of the video, but I want to still tackle it. So he brings up this idea that, well, Jesus was not talking literally here. So basically, he was just using some kind of hyperbole just to make a point that what Judas did was really, really bad, right? Would it have been better if he'd never been born? It's just a way of saying that basically you did something really, really, really bad, Judas. Okay. Now, this by itself, to be honest, doesn't sound convincing at all. He brings up some passages that are similar in Matthew, where Jesus says, well, it would have been better for you to cut off your hand if that causes you to sin, or pluck an eye out of your head if that causes you to sin, or even kill yourself, right, if you cause one of these little ones to sin. And so since there, his argument is Jesus was talking figuratively, then of course that means that also here, in this case of Judas, he must have been talking figuratively. Now, this is a weak argument because we are taking the fact that Jesus was talking figuratively somewhere else and somehow inferring that in this particular case, given that he had been talking figuratively before, must be talking figuratively also here. It just does not follow. Now, I agree that the passages, the examples that he brings up are kind of similar to what we hear in the episode of Judas, but they're not really comparable if you think about that, right? Why? Well, simply because in those passages that he brings out, oh, it would be better for you to pluck an eye off you, cut off your hands, kill yourself. In that case, is there a chance that Jesus was talking literally? No, there was no chance. Hopefully, there's nobody that is, daring enough to say that Jesus was talking. That there's a chance that Jesus was literally meaning that we need to chop off our hand or kill ourselves, right? This is qualitatively different from the case of Judas. This guy that unfortunately I don't know his name, so I'm gonna keep talking about him like this guy. So this guy himself admits that in this particular case with Judas, there is a chance that Jesus may have talked literally. Now, maybe he's applying a very low probability to that possibility, but nevertheless, he admits that there is that possibility. So already you see that the two cannot be compared, cannot be really put together. It's a qualitatively completely different statement of Jesus. In the other examples, Jesus was saying, well, it would have been better if you do this or if you do that. So it gives, some responsibility or some way out that is dependent on that person. If the person has a choice to do A or B, and Jesus says, well, it would be better if you do A rather than B, right? In this case, it's a statement that goes to a completely different level, right? He says it would have been better if you'd never been born at all. Like, it's not even in your hand anymore, right? It's not that it would be better for you to do this or do that. It would be better if you never existed at all, right? So I understand that there's some similarity on the surface, but really, you cannot use those to say, oh, here, absolutely, with 100% certainty, Jesus was talking figuratively. And he himself admits that there may be the possibility to take Jesus seriously here. So let's jump to his most strong counter-argument.
The point we come to now is probably the most obvious one, and you've probably all already noticed it. For the most part, we've been approaching the text with a conventional assumption that Christ is implying that it would have been better for Judas had he never existed at all. But in verse 24, Christ's actual words are, it would have been better for him if he had not been born. Most commentators treat the idea of Judas's birth as if it's synonymous with his existence. But is this accurate? The Old Testament gives us the answer.
All right. So I had to admit that the first time I heard this, I was like, oh, wow, I never thought about that from that point of view. I always assumed that when Jesus meant never been born, it meant never existed, right? But yeah, it's true. If you think about it, being existing does not necessarily mean being born. For example, we exist in the womb of our mother before being born, right? So existence doesn't necessarily imply the fact that we are born, all right? So, okay, I concede that. I concede that, sure. Now he's gonna give some example to show that basically our existence precedes the fact that we are born. Um, I'm gonna script to that because I agree. Hopefully we are all Christians. We are against abortion. Hopefully, so we all believe that a baby in their mother's womb is a human being, is existing. So, all right, point conceded. One thing that I would like him to clarify is because he really never specified this, so it remained in my mind like something that a little confusing. He never makes the point that okay, never been born doesn't mean never been conceived, which is what I think he means. But he never brings up the idea of conception, um, almost implying that we may exist even before conception. I don't know if I got it right. I don't know if that's what he means, but I would like him to clarify. But anyway, this is completely irrelevant to the point. So I'm going to skip to that part and get to where the real argument starts.
For as a first century Jew speaking to first century Jews, Jesus would have recognized the Old Testament as the ultimate authority for his audience and would have been deliberate about wording his teaching with it in mind. So, what does the Old Testament tell us about this question of existence in relation to birth? Did Jesus and the disciples believe that existence began at birth? Let's consider just a couple of well known texts. In Psalm 139, David is marveling at the omniscience and omnipresence of God. And in verses 13 through 16, he says, "For you formed my inward parts, you knitted me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works, my soul knows it very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was being made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw my unformed substance. In your book were written every one of them, the days that were formed for me, when as yet there was none of them." So David was saying, before I set apart for the work of the Lord. At this point, any remaining ambiguity ought to give way to clarity.
Start again.
To Jesus and to his audience, existence didn't begin at birth.
Point considered.
Rather, before anyone is born, they are formed and seen and known by the Lord. There's clearly a big difference then between not being born and not existing at all.
All right.
The relevance of this point can't be emphasized enough. Jesus didn't say that Judas would have been better off never existing. He said Judas would have been better off never being born.
Now, I want to challenge this. Now, again, I don't think this is the main flaw in the reasoning, but I think this statement is not correct. Now, what Jesus said can be interpreted in two ways. Can be interpreted it would have been better if he never been born, or also it would have been better if he never been conceived. Why? Well, because the Greek verb used there is the verb genau, which means sometimes means to be born, sometimes means to be conceived. In fact, in Matthew, when the angel speaks to Joseph, he uses that same verb, saying the baby that is conceived in Mary's womb. Right at that point, Jesus had not been born yet. Right, but the verb is the same. So the verb, in some sense, can mean to be born. In some sense, can mean to be conceived. Right. So this is not even true 100%. It doesn't exclude the possibility that Jesus meant really being born and not conceived. But just wanted to make it clear that it's not so clear that Jesus meant birth. It could have even meant conception. And so in that case would be existence. Unless he's claiming that we exist somehow spiritually even before conception, which by the way would be very weird, but all right. But anyway, it's not even relevant to the point. Just wanted to highlight that.
This point alone causes the whole conventional argument for unending torment, as it is presented from this text, to collapse.
All right, this is a big statement, right? So basically saying the moment that we realize that Jesus is not speaking it would about existence in general, but simply the fact that never been born. So basically Jesus said Jesus didn't say if he had never existed, but if he had been if he had died in his mother belly or something like that. It would have been better if he had died in his mother belly, right? That's what he basically is saying, or something along that line. All right. So he's saying once you realize that this is what Jesus meant, well, this whole argument that supposedly debunks universalism just collapses. But does it?
If we remember Barnes' argument, for example, he said, if there should be any period when the sufferings of Judas should end, and he be restored and raised to heaven, the blessings of that happiness without end would infinitely overbalance all the sufferings he could endure in a limited time, and consequently, it would not be true that it would have been better for him to have not been born. The problem with this conventional interpretation is that Barnes, as well as others, are treating Judas' birth as if it signifies Judas's very existence. But as we've seen, Christ's words don't demand that we assume this. To take Jesus' statement literally, we really only need to believe that Judas's suffering would have been reduced by any measure had he never been born. This point probably doesn't need to be demonstrated in any more detail, but just so we're all on the same page, let's lay this out.
All right. So I'm grateful to him that he put up this graph that now he's going to illustrate because he's making his line of reasoning very clear and very simple to understand. So let's try to see what he's saying here.
Compare two timelines of Judas's life. The first timeline shows Judas's existence before birth, shows his earthly life, and then shows his existence after death. Now imagine also that just for the sake of argument, that Judas will be punished twice as much in the next life for all the evil that he committed in his earthly life, but will eventually be released from such punishment. I realize this is a crude way to think about this, but just hang with me. Now picture a second timeline, where we also see Judas existing before birth, but then dying before he is born, and arriving immediately in the next life. Having never betrayed Jesus in his earthly life, he arrives in the next life with a clean slate, and the evil that he would have committed is not counted against him. In the first timeline, Judas is born, and in the second timeline, Judas is not born. And because he is born in the first timeline, he is doomed to experience a great deal of purgation. Yet because he is not born in the second timeline, such purgation is unnecessary. Any child could compare these two timelines and conclude that the one without suffering is preferable.
All right. So this is the counter argument. Okay. So let me go back to the graph itself. Let's try to explain it. He explained it very well, but just to summarize, right? So the first timeline is the actual life of Judas according to universalists, right? So the yellow part is the existence before birth. Again, I think that is from conception until birth. There's 9 months in his mother womb. Maybe he's want to extend a little bit more before even conception. I don't know, but it's irrelevant. Then you have the green part, which is Judas' life on earth, which could have been of a, let's say, of a positive value. Let's assume we don't really know, but let's assume that the green part has some kind of positive value. Then you have the punishment in hell, that red segment, which definitely has a big negative value. And then you have this blue line that extends to infinity, which is eternal life in heaven, which has this infinite positive value. All right. The second timeline is this hypothetical case, Jesus never being born, existing but never being born. So existing, let's say, in his mother womb, the yellow part, then died, let's say, died at birth. Okay. And what happens to Judas? What would have happened to Judas in that case? Well, he would have gone straight to heaven. So his blue line, his eternal life in heaven, would have been the blue line there. All right. Now, his conclusion is, well, even a little child compares these two timeline and would say which one is preferable. Well, of course, the second one, right? You wouldn't go through the first one. So let's see what he has to say on top of this.
Born in the first timeline, he is doomed to experience a great deal of purgation. Yet because he is not born in the second timeline, such purgation is unnecessary. Any child could compare these two timelines and conclude that the one without suffering is preferable. We don't have to believe that Judas will suffer unending punishment in hell for Christ's words to make sense. If the gravity or length of Judas's suffering in the next life outweighs the gravity or length of any good he experienced in his earthly life, then Judas would have been better off never being born.
All right, so this is the conclusion, right? So let's go back to his graph, see if I can get it. All right, here it is. He's saying, as long as this red line here is worse than this green life, green segment here, right? If the punishment in hell that Judas would go through there is of a greater value, negative value, than the positive value that Judas experienced in his earthly life, well, at that point, timeline 2 is preferable. You don't need to have this red line extending forever for Jesus' words to make sense. Now, these on the surface seem convincing from a logical point of view. And actually, when I heard it first, I was like, he makes sense. He has a point here. But then I thought about it a couple of minutes more, and I was like, well, wait a second. This still does not make any sense, right? Why? Because this idea that the second timeline is better than the first one is always true no matter what, right? It doesn't really matter if the red line is bigger than the green line, if the red line is smaller than the green line, if the red line is not even there. Like, the second timeline is always better than the first timeline. So this anathema that Jesus launched against Judas, well, is actually a statement that Jesus could have applied to every single human being ever born. If what he's saying is correct, is true, it means that we are born, so every human being that was ever born, it would have been better if he had died in their mother's womb. Why? Well, because it really doesn't matter how long this green segment is, how short that red segment is. You can even take the red segment out completely. The point is that, you see, the only difference between the second timeline and the first timeline, if you subtract, right, the two in your mind, the only difference is the part that is delimited between the green and the yellow segment. Before that, the yellow part is the same. After that, the blue part is the same. So the only difference is there. And of course, the blue part, the blue segment, it will always be of a higher value than whatever green combined with the red in the first time. Let me give you an analogy. Imagine that I tell you, you have two doors in front of you. So if you enter the first door, you're going to start experiencing this amazing banquet where you're gonna meet all your friends. You're gonna have this amazing experience, the amazing party. You're gonna have a great time. You're gonna start eating, and you're gonna end up forever and ever in that state. You're never gonna get tired of it. You're gonna live in this absolute state of happiness forever. The other option is, well, you can take the other door there, and there's first one room that you need to go through. And in that room, you may suffer, you may have some good experiences there, but mainly suffering and pain. And by the way, if you do something wrong while you are in that room, you're going to have to enter another room where you're going to have to suffer a lot for whatever you did wrong in the first room. And only after you have suffered a lot, eventually you're going to be able to enter this third room and finally experience this beautiful, party with your friends forever and ever. which door you want to open. There's not even the option there, right? It's game theory. Like every single person would say the first option, right? Nobody would go the second option. So hopefully this is clear, right? If this is correct, this is not just true for Judas. It's true for everybody, which would make the statement of Jesus completely irrelevant, completely useless. Um, there was absolutely no need for Jesus to say something like that, because something like that could be told to anybody. And to be clear, this setup, this analogy works in any case. Even if in the second option you have a good experience in the first room you enter, meaning your earthly life, you receive more blessing than suffering. Even if Jesus on the Sermon on the Mount tells us and warns us that we're going to receive probably more suffering and persecution than blessing during earthly life. But even assuming that we have an overall positive experience on earth, and we don't even go through the suffering of the second rule, and we're going to immediately jump to this amazing banquet, still no positive experience on earth can be comparable to being in heaven with God, right? So in any case, option one is preferable to option two. So these words of Jesus really could apply not to some of us, but to really every single one of us, which should point to the fact that this is not possibly what Jesus meant. So at this point, I think it's clear. This objection I'm bringing up seems to deflate completely this counter argument that the Orthodox Universalists brought up. But I admit that there may be something that still I'm not completely grasping in his logic. Maybe I'm missing something. Maybe there's a flaw in my logic. So I would really like this person's honest opinion. And so I'm waiting for his response. That's all for now. Like and subscribe. God bless you.